Welcome to Profiles. I'm Charlie Walters. You're watching Nantucket Community Television, Channel 18. With me today in the studio is Joe Hagan. He's the author of Sticky Fingers, a biography of Jan Wenner, the editor and founder of Rolling Stone magazine. He is a special correspondent for Vanity Fair magazine. He has also written for Rolling Stone, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and New York Magazine, among many other publications. And among his subjects have been Hillary Clinton, Henry Kissinger, and Dan Rather. He's also an expert on Nina Simone. He found Nina Simone's secret diaries and wrote about them in The Believer. He also talked about them on my radio show, I Know Blue Notes, in the summer of 2018. We're not going to talk about most of that stuff today. We're going to talk about his current project, which is a CD of music that he came across under circumstances I'll let you describe.
Okay.
Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I as you mentioned, wrote this book, Sticky Fingers, which it's a biography of Jan Wenner, who founded Rolling Stone magazine. It's really kind of a cultural history of the rock and roll age, 50 years of rock and roll and how it came out in the magazine and the man behind it. Well, in the course of that, writing that book, which took me about 4 years, I came to interview a guy named Earl Mcgrath. Now, most people haven't heard of Earl Mcgrath, but he was a kind of guy who was famous to the famous in the 1970s. He kind of was a social connector. He was worked in the record business. He had worked in the movie business as a screenwriter at one time, kind of a dilettante really, but became very important in the art world because he became an art collector and befriended some artists who became big names like Rauschenberg, Larry Rivers, Bruce Nauman, and of course he knew Andy Warhol, and he has this role in the book. There's another artist, a painter named Bryce Marden, a famous painter, who says of Earl that he taught people how to be rich, and so he. His wife was a famous, or not famous, but a wealthy Italian countess named Camilla Pecci Blunt. And he married her, I believe, in the early 60s. And eventually, Earl Mcgrath becomes the head of Rolling Stone's records and becomes a friend of Mick Jagger's and becomes something like a social secretary for him when the Stones are in New York in the late 70s. And a lot of parties happened at Earl's house. So, long story short, I interviewed him for this book, and he died a couple of years later. He was in his 70s. He was not in great health. And his wife had died, and so he was living alone on West 57th Street, right across from Carnegie Hall in New York. And I had become Facebook friends with him, and saw that his estate was being sold off because he had no heirs really, and his art collection was sold at Christie's, and it was like they made this beautiful catalog for his work that he owned, and then they were liquidating his estate otherwise, selling it off just to wholesale people or friends or whoever wanted to come by the apartment and look. And so I was looking for photographs for my book, and I remembered that his wife was a wonderful photographer who had documented their crazy social life from the 50s until the 80s. And you're talking about these beautiful, just, old-fashioned photo albums. And she was Italian and wrote all these beautiful Italian captions in them. And there's like, here's Mick Jagger and Richard Gere and Jan Wenner and Annie Leibovitz on a yacht in 1982. Or here's a party in the early 70s with, the Everly Brothers and, Cy Twombly, who was also a friend of Earl's. And so these were, I thought, I'd like to get some of these. And if you check out my book, Sticky Fingers, you'll see that the photo credits to many of the photos are Camilla Mcgrath, who was Earl's wife. So I went to that apartment to look at these photographs. And while I was there, kind of was snooping around and saw that there were piles of records in the closet. And I'm a record collector and a music fan, so I went in there and I was very excited to look at these. And then I remember this was a very tall, Manhattan walk-in closet that had maybe like 12 feet ceilings. And I remember looking up and seeing rows and rows of reel-to-reel tapes kind of stowed up above the door. And I asked the woman who was sort of managing this apartment, I said, what are those? She goes, oh, that was from when he worked at Atlantic Records in the 70s, and we're just we're selling that off to a record wholesale buyer, a guy that was just going to come and buy all the records and take them away. And I said, well, do you have a stepladder? And so she brought one out, and because I wanted to check it out, to find out what these tapes were. My imagination kind of went wild at that moment. And I remember the first tape I pulled off, which was like a big 10-inch studio tape, was a master tape to side 2 of Some Girls by the Rolling Stones. And so suddenly I'm looking at this, and I just, broke into a sweat. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. And then I just saw there were all these tapes, and there were studio tapes from Rolling Stones, but there were also demo tapes from Hall & Oates, or the New York Dolls, one of them said, and there was all these names that were familiar and unfamiliar on all of these tapes. So of course I come down from this ladder, and I'm like, oh my gosh, what are you doing with this stuff? You have to take responsibility. This is history here. And the woman really didn't know what to do with it. And the next day, after thinking it through, I said, well, I would like to buy all those tapes from you, if you're just going to sell them to just anybody. And so she went to some of the people who were kind of running the estate, Earl's estate, and said, yeah, okay, we'll sell them to you. And so 2 days later, I pulled up in a truck at West 57th Street, and I took all these tapes home. There were about 250 of them.
My God.
And I just was sitting there not really knowing what to do with them. I was very excited, and I actually own a reel-to-reel player, which is a real weird thing, but I, was interested in finding tapes like this anyway. So I started one by one throwing these tapes on the player. Let's see what's on them. And there was just all manner of interesting little historical crevices from, entire tapes of where Earl had just recorded the radio, freeform radio in Los Angeles in 1969, just an entire tape. You can just listen to the radio in 1969. Then there were demo tapes by the actual demo tapes of Hall & Oates when they were trying to get a record deal in 1969. It was called, they were called Whole Oates at the time.
Whole Oates.
Whole Oates, which became the name of their first album.
Yep.
And there were Delbert Mcclinton, who some people may know from the country world. His first band, Delbert and Glenn, were on there. Tons of their tapes, because they actually signed to a deal that Earl Mcgrath had made for them. And all kinds of mainly obscure groups that I'd never heard. And some of them were terrible, and I would throw it on. But some of them were fabulous. And I was like, nobody ever discovered this singer or this band, because they had one demo, it got thrown in the closet, and nobody ever heard of them again. So after a while, I came up with an idea, I should make a record that is like a compilation of all of these unknown, unheard tapes, and take responsibility for this music in a way, preserve it somehow. And I decided I would call it Earl's Closet, because that's where I found it. It was all in Earl Mcgrath's closet. And I also thought I could write a brief biography of Earl, and it could go inside this record as as liner notes, essentially.
So you were thinking in terms of vinyl in the beginning.
Yeah, well, it is going to be on vinyl.
And CD?
And CD. And so what I did is I went to this record label in Los Angeles called Light in the Attic Records, which is a great boutique kind of label that reissues a lot of lost material or records that haven't been issued in a long time. And they're really great company. And I went to them with this idea. I pitched it to them. I wrote a pitch and showed them what I had, and they were very excited about it. And so it's coming out next year. And it's going to be like a gatefold, old-fashioned record with gatefold, with a booklet inside that will tell the story of Earl Mcgrath, whose biography alone, putting aside the music, is a lost history, like an unbelievable secret history of a guy who kind of almost Zelig-like travels through the worlds of poetry and literature, rock and roll, art world, you name it, and kind of synthesizes them through his own social travels. And when I interviewed him, we were sitting on a couch. He said, this is where Mick Jagger met Jerry Hall, on this couch that we're sitting on at my party in 1976. And so he had those kind of wonderful stories. And incredible history. And so I thought I should make this a part of this album, since they were his tapes, essentially, and he saved them, and which not everybody does, right? Or did from that era. If they had piles of these old tapes, they would have thought, well, why keep them? And a lot of them either got thrown out or lost along the way. But here we have this little slice of history, this kind of like little core sample from the 1970s of all kinds of stuff. And that's, it's sort of been an adventure that I've fallen into to produce this album.
So the album's going to have the obscure artists. You're not going to have, for example, the Rolling Stones.
Well, not the Stones. It would be very difficult to get the licensing on that, because they would obviously not be interested in, like, I've considered it, but I don't want to get into like a legal hassle with them over it, And I also thought it would be more interesting to hear stuff that people hadn't heard before, really. And the stuff that will be on the album, there's going to be about roughly 22 songs on it. Most people will never have heard before. One artist I'm really excited about who's on it is named Terry Allen, who think people should look up on Google. He's a wonderful kind of Texas troubadour who sings these funky songs on piano.
He went on to do other things after
he
made the music that you came across.
Well, during the time and after, he's a visual artist mainly, and some of his work's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He's like he's a well-known Los Angeles visual artist and sculptor, and he's a real character, West Texas character, and his music is really wonderful. So I found his demo tapes, and it was wonderful to be able to call up a person like that. And I ended up interviewing Daryl Hall from Hall & Oates for the liner notes too, and hear their stories about how they came to know this guy Earl and got this record deal, and how their kind of lives transpired during the time. For instance, Daryl Hall, and John Oates were from Philadelphia. They were like doo-wop guys, and who were trying to kind of expand on doo-wop to do folk and soul and other kinds of music at the time. Although at the very beginning they wanted to sound like the band, and so their demo sounds a lot like the band, Robbie Robertson and the band. And
so is that going to be on the record?
Yeah,
really.
And so they, when I interviewed him, he said, "Yeah, well, we came to New York to try to get a record deal. It really wasn't working out, and somebody suggested we get a hold of Earl, and Earl said, well, why don't you come out to Los Angeles? I'm having a party." And they had never been to Los Angeles before, so they went to Los Angeles. The first time Hall & Oates are really out of the East Coast. And they go to this fabulous party that he throws. And he was known for throwing these big fabulous parties. And the Everly Brothers were there. Harrison Ford was there, who was Earl's carpenter at the time. Because before he was an actor, he was a carpenter, and so he was Earl Mcgrath's personal carpenter, which is typical of Earl to have these kinds of star-studded friendships. And I guess at the party, Earl's like, well, why don't you guys play? Here you are at the party. So Hall & Oates started playing in the middle of the party. And afterwards, Earl said, okay, you're signed. Come back to New York and we'll meet Ahmet Ertegun, the founder of Atlantic Records. And the rest is history. That's how they were signed.
Wow.
And so, this is, it's kind of serendipity, and it's very much of the time when, somebody could be launched into a career kind of like as easy as that, right?
Talk about the licensing, because that was probably the most difficult thing you had to do, was go through all of that.
Well, it's difficult, but it's also fun, because what you have to do is go find these artists. And a lot of the artists on my album, there's a band called Shadow that didn't make it. They were from Detroit, and they signed on to Earl's label. Earl had a short-lived label called Clean Records. Their motto was "Everybody has a clean record," and they signed on to the label. They came to New York, and there was a big party for them. They were going to be, the next big power pop band. They sound a lot like, maybe if people have heard of the Raspberries or Eric Carmen, they had that kind of vibe to them. And but the producer, one of the people involved in the album, wanted them to use an orchestra along with the songs. And it was the same orchestra that the Bee Gees were using at the time. And the lead singer thought this was the most terrible idea he could imagine having an orchestra in his rock and roll group, and he refused to use this orchestra, and they were promptly dropped from the label.
Huh.
So then their demo tapes were
In
shuffled
Earl
off to Earl's
McGrath's
closet.
closet.
Yeah. And so, the guy, the lead singer, had since died. He had a drug problem, like you learn a lot of these people of the era had. But I got a hold of his widow and the other guitar player from the band. They couldn't believe that I had found these tapes. They were overjoyed to find they were discovered, and were happy to, sign off the licensing. And because these were demo tapes, the demo tapes were not owned by the labels. And that helped me in a lot of ways.
They don't own the demo tapes.
No, and that was a huge kind of like benefit for me to be able to do this, because really they would only own what they paid to record and had licensed for the first album on, say it was Atlantic or Clean Records or Rolling Stones Records. Another artist that's on it that was funded also is Jim Carroll. People may know the poet Jim Carroll of the Basketball Diaries. Yeah, so I have a bunch of his tapes, studio tapes, and I found a wonderful recording that's never been released of his. And then I called his widow, Rosemary, and she was really gracious and excited about it, and signed off on it as well. There was a model. Andy Warhol had these superstars, right? These women who were in his films, and one was named Ultraviolet.
Yes.
It was a visual artist. She had a demo tape of music she had made, and I'm using a track from her. And so a lot of it has been an adventure of meeting some of these people. There's one fellow whose name is escaping me right at this moment, but who had this beautiful pop song, and I found him. He never made it in the business, but he became a recording engineer himself. But I call him up, and he tells me the story of how growing up, his stepfather, was the director Ed Wood, right, who made Plan B from Outer Space, and his mother was in the movie. The Plan B movie, the sort of a famous kitschy sci-fi movie from the 50s. And he just described growing up with the stepfather, who was a cross-dresser, and this unusual Hollywood circumstance, right? Another great artist was Mark Rodney, whose father was Red Rodney, who played trumpet with Charlie Parker in the 50s and 60s. And so Mark Rodney had tried to make it as a pop star as well, and he'd been in a very obscure group with probably the worst name ever, called Batdorf and Rodney.
Oh yes, I remember them.
Yeah, so the Rodney of that group, I found his demo, and it was a really great song, actually. And I called him up, and he had all these wild stories of growing up in Hollywood in the 60s, and he had befriended Chris Christopherson and got into all kinds of misadventures. So for every attempt to get a licensing agreement, out came stories. And for me as a journalist, this is what's motivating me to produce this record and to get involved in it, is to yield all these wonderful stories that I can use in this essay I'm writing.
You should write a whole book about this.
Well, I've thought about it, and I'm going to start with just this. And by the way, the record label is really fabulous. They do really beautiful packaging, and they're going to make a little booklet with photos inside that will be inside the record, and they're going to publish something like a New Yorker-sized profile that I'm going to write inside. So it's a real opportunity for me to almost like publish a little book, but with records, and I kind of love that idea.
So this will be out sometime in 2020. Do you know when?
It'll probably be coming out next year in conjunction with like the holidays, but it will also be published simultaneously to that, a book of Camilla McGrath's photography. Alfred Knopf is going to be publishing a book of photography that his wife did, and these photographs are really remarkable. I mean, it's like a whole kind of like private world of the 60s, 70s, and 80s of people that you know, people that you don't know, but kind of a social world that you may not have been privy to before. Because the McGraths had a very, people like Mick Jagger liked to hang out with them because they knew whatever happened with them was going to be private. because these were not public people. They did not seek publicity. They just liked being around creative people. And so it's a world of creative people like Harrison Ford and Peter Wolf of the Jay Giles Band, or David Johansen from the New York Dolls, Mick Jagger, Jim Carroll, Bruce Nauman, Faye Dunaway, all kinds of people that they would socialize with. They knew if they were with the McGraths, they were going to have a good time. They were going to meet all kinds of creative, interesting people, and they were going to be in a kind of private bubble. And so this is finally, after all these years, we're able to kind of peer into this wonderful secret history. And it's a world, it's almost like the McGraths were kind of a social network, but a very small, elite, little jet-setter world. And it's kind of delicious little peek into a world people like to look at and read about.
And what about those Stones tapes?
Well, they're sitting in my closet at home, and I don't know what to do with them, is the real truth of the matter. But I could sell them, but I don't really want to. I like having them. I have, this is getting into the weeds a little bit, but magnetic tape, as people used to record, and some still do now. All albums were recorded on magnetic tape back in the 60s, 70s. And this tape, it doesn't last forever, and it has to be kind of revived and taken care of. And
it does deteriorate over time.
Yeah, and what they do is they bake the tapes to revive them.
Yeah, they literally bake them.
They bake them, and I had a record engineer, great guy named Steve Adabo, who he's been remastering all these Dylan reissues, the Rolling Thunder and the Blood on the Tracks. I went to him, somebody introduced me to him with my project and said, can you advise me a little bit about what to do with these tapes? And he helped me transfer a few of them, and he taught me how to bake tapes in an oven, which is a very weird thing to do. But it does the trick.
It actually works.
Yeah, he takes these tapes from the vaults. Okay, here is the literal tapes that, Bob Dylan recorded on, and he'll put them in an oven. And, for 2 hours at a very low heat. And this is really getting into the weeds, but it's interesting, and it revives these tapes, and you're able to, remaster them, re-engineer them, make them sound better, and be working with the original source material, which I'm now in the business of doing suddenly with these tapes I have. It's an exciting side project for me. It's definitely not going to get me rich, but it's going to be fun when it comes out.
Do the Stones know you've got those tapes?
Well, they do now that they're watching, Nantucket TV. No, they don't, and I'm not really, I have, I looked into it enough to know that these tapes are kind of like bought and sold by dealers all the time. You can't broadcast it or make money off of it. It's just, you just have the object, which is the tape, and that's all you own. You don't have rights to the music, obviously. But they're nice as objects. I mean, they're kind of like a beautiful piece of history.
There is a difference, most people don't realize this, between the tape itself and what's on the tape.
Yes.
It's not the same thing.
No, I know, and that was a thing for me to learn. I had to learn all of this, along the way.
This isn't the first time you've come across something that other people might not have come across ever.
Yeah.
I mentioned the Nina Simone Diaries.
Yeah.
And let me plug my radio show for a minute.
Yeah.
In the summer of 2018, Joe was a guest on my radio show, Island Blue Notes, and we talked about the Nina Simone tapes, or diaries rather, and you played some of her songs on my show with commentary. But briefly, tell us about the secret diaries and how you came across them.
Sure. Well, it was really one of the most exciting things that I've ever had the pleasure to be involved with, and it was mainly kind of an accidental thing where I just happened to be a Nina Simone fan. Listening to her records one night, I thought it'd be really interesting to read a book about her, and I began to sort of explore what's out there for biographies of her. And I didn't really find much. It was sort of thin. And I thought, well, maybe I should look into this a little bit. And I'm a journalist, I get curious, and the internet offers endless possibilities of just looking people up and writing them an email and saying, hey, what's going on? So I wrote like a Nina Simone fan website, and I said, who's controls her estate and who's involved with her legacy. And this person said, well, there's her daughter, Lisa Simone, and then there is her ex-husband, Andy Stroud was his name. And he lives in the Bronx. You should just look him up. You're in New York, call him up. And I thought, it's as simple as that, I'll do it. And so I looked up his phone number. There he was in the phone book. I called him. And he was this sort of grumpy old man, but he said, oh, I have all kinds of Nina Simone material, but what are you going to pay me for it? He was real meat and potatoes kind of business. And this is common in the music business, I've learned, like
It's common in business.
Yeah. And with people who are the legacy families of deceased artists, you find a lot of squabbling over the, legacy and over who's going to get the money. And so this was no different than that in many ways. But, well, I told him, well, I can't really promise you anything. I don't have any money, but I'd love to write about it, whatever you have, or talk to you about your history with her. And, I didn't do anything about it at first because he was demanding money. But a few months later, I called him up again, and he said, hey, where you been? I thought you were going to call me back. And I said, well, I don't have any money to pay you. And he goes, well, just come up to my house in the Bronx and we'll talk about it. And he lived in an apartment and kind of in a assisted living place because he was pretty old and infirm at this point. And I went up to his apartment and sat down and had lunch with him, and he brought out this diary that he opened up, and it said, this book belongs to Eunice Waymans, the real name of Nina Simone. And I was sort of just struck dumb. I was in shock, as just looking at this. Here's her writing for pages and pages and pages, and it's all from the 60s. And I'm thinking, wow, this is a magical piece of material right here. And in addition to that, he had piles of letters, correspondence with her from all through that period. And it basically was through the period of his marriage to her, which was volatile and violent and dramatic and tragic, really. And the diary kind of went into that and into her emotional state during all the period she was making her most famous music. And he granted me the right to look at it and to copy it and to write about it. And I interviewed him for probably 13 or 14 hours over the summer. I want to say 2009 or 10. And it resulted in an article that I wrote. It was originally actually an assignment for Vanity Fair.
Really?
And the editor who assigned it to me left the magazine before I finished it. And the new editor decided, we're not interested in this, which I would hope they regret, because then when I published it elsewhere, it became a big, it had a lot of impact. It was reprinted in the Times of London. It was used as material in a documentary that came out on Netflix. I was a consultant on that documentary, and it was really just, it's a classic case of what is great about being a reporter and what about it being a journalist is having a curiosity, making a few phone calls, pulling a little bit of thread, and then next thing you know, you just find yourself in these wonderful positions to be able to tell a story that's never been told.
And that article is available on the internet.
That's right, yeah. If you look up my name, Joe Hagan, and Nina Simone, it'll pop right up. And it was a real labor of love, that article. I loved finding those diaries. I felt like a great responsibility to get it right and to tell the story as and I became friends a little bit with her daughter, and had a real exciting interaction with the Nina Simone story.
Talking about Vanity Fair.
Yeah.
You are now a special correspondent
Yeah.
for Vanity Fair. You've had 2 cover stories in the last year, one about Michael B. Jordan and the other about Beto O'Rourke.
Beto O'Rourke.
What does it mean to be a special correspondent?
I think it's just a kind of made up special name for the masthead. My editor, I often laugh about it because what's so special about your corresponding so far? It just basically, I think that maybe in another age they would have said editor at large. You're sort of, you have a little more liberty to choose your subjects, and you get put on special assignments. It really doesn't mean a whole hell of a lot, is the real truth of the matter. But for me, it means that I get to, write big splashy profiles, magazine profiles, and which I enjoy. I've always been kind of focused on biography and on profiling writing. So that's my specialty, really. If I'm special in any way. Yeah.
Well, do you pitch an idea to them? Do they give you an assignment, or is it both? Or
yeah, we negotiated a little bit. Yeah, I mean, the Michael B. Jordan ones, they assigned me, and they said, well, this isn't your usual thing, but that's why we want to assign it to you. We think that you could bring something interesting to the subject, and that was a challenge for me, because I don't think I knew much about Michael B. Jordan's work. He was kind of a new face in Hollywood, and we were going to be helping kind of, establish him and put him on the cover of Vanity Fair, and he had a new movie. And so I went into it kind of trying to figure out what was going to be interesting about it, and what, actors can be interesting, but they're not always interesting. And I hadn't done a lot of that. In fact, that was the first major Hollywood profile I'd ever done. And what was interesting about it to me was he was real honest and confessional. But what ended up being really interesting is I met his parents. And his parents were super fascinating to me. And I ended up kind of like making maybe a quarter of the article about his upbringing. He'd come up in Newark, and his parents were really involved in kind of like political activism, kind of black social consciousness of the 60s. They had really been involved in the father was really committed to like black history and Pan-African movement of the late 60s, and how that kind of percolated in Newark, New Jersey, where Michael B. Jordan was from. And what I loved about this is he's in the movie Black Panther, for people that don't know. He was the product of kind of some of the black social kind of thinking and political activism of the 60s and 70s. And so I was interested in that, and how they reared him in a town that was like known for its like violence and inner city problems, and they kind of shielded him from that and educated him in black history. And he went to a black kind of politically minded school growing up, and so I get really interested in the biography aspects of people.
And yet he ended up in Hollywood, which is not what you would have
his
guessed
mom,
or predicted.
to make money, to make ends meet, they had a catering company, his parents. To make ends meet, they started putting him in modeling, because somebody in a dentist office said, your son's really handsome, you should put him you should be a model. And so he ends up doing modeling, and one thing leads to another, and he gets cast in The Wire on HBO, which was an amazing, groundbreaking TV show, and that's where he made his name. Initially, it was as a character on The Wire, and I think David Simon cast him because he seemed so unvarnished and not studied, in a way that helped him. And then he used that as a way to kind of evolve as an actor, and now he's a superstar.
He also likes to drive fast.
He likes to drive fast. I got that was the sort of the opening scene of the story, was me in his. Now I'm forgetting the model of it. It was like a sleek sports car.
I can't remember, but
and
it moved.
It moved very fast and frightened me half to death, is the truth. And I remember my life flashing before my eyes in a real way, driving around with him. But then I also realized when we stopped driving like that he had just written the opening scene for me, because it was like, I was like, well, that was something special, right? Yeah, so, and then of course I did the Beto O'Rourke cover story, which has something of a dubious legacy at this point.
Well, things have changed for Beto
Yeah.
in the months after that article came out.
Yeah.
Are you surprised?
I was a little bit surprised. It was a little bit of an education in the current political environment to have written a story that made such a big splash and then watch how it got digested on Twitter and on the media in general, and to kind of get, it was almost like a, a sounding of like our political moment to see that it's pretty vicious. And there was a quote on the cover of the Vanity Fair. It said, man, I was born to be in it, right?
Yeah.
And when he said that, in the context of the article, he was just sort of expressing his enthusiasm to run, But the way it was taken was that this was like a privileged comment, that he was like a, self-anointed young white guy, and he was, beaten over the head and shoulders by everybody for having said that. And he kind of came out of the gate stumbling, really. And I think he was sort of not happy about the way that ended up affecting him. He also went about kind of apologizing profusely for every kind of gaffe that he made as soon as he came out, including this one, and expressing regret for doing it, which I always thought was kind of a mistake.
If you have to apologize or explain, you're in trouble, as I'm always hearing a talking head say on television.
Yeah, and he did a lot of that coming out of the gate, and it didn't. I think it hurt him. It made him seem kind of weak. Somebody put it to me a few weeks ago, kind of perfectly. They said, "Well, if he can't survive a Vanity Fair cover story, he's not going to be able to go up against Donald Trump." And I said, "That's actually a good point, And I think, I don't think it hurt him too bad. I think in the world of Twitter and the political commentariat, he took some, lashings for having come out of the gate with his campaign on the cover of Vanity Fair. It seemed kind of presumptuous to some people. But it also kind of maybe evinced a little bit of his naivete about, how he would be received coming out of the gate, because he was almost like there's a great Texas commentator who told me, I said, well, I was asking him what it was like seeing Beto run against Ted Cruz in Texas.
Whom he almost beat.
He said, wow, the fervor around him was like Jesus Christ Superstar. He described it. And there was a little bit of like just a little bit of a messianic vibe around Beto. And I think to the degree Beto was buying into his own, popularity, some of that came out in the article, I think, my article. And I think that, because it was right there. I mean, he has an incredible anecdote in the book about his third campaign stop running against Ted Cruz. And he was in Houston, and the crowd was wrapped, and it was everybody lined up against the walls. It was standing room only. And he said, I went in with no speech. He said, I just came out and the words were just coming out of me as if they were being pulled out by the crowd. I just felt like I had this connection to the crowd. And I understood what he meant, and it was, but it was like a semi-mystical kind of. And when he's told me that, I remember thinking, as a journalist, little flags go up in your mind when you're interviewing people. And you're thinking, oh, that's interesting, that he describes it that way. And then his wife had chimed in, and she was adding to this, saying, oh, we were blown away by this experience. And you realize that they were on this kind of like magical mystery tour that they themselves didn't fully comprehend, but they felt like a responsibility to act on because of their political convictions, right? Now that doesn't necessarily mean you should, right? And so now he's learning the hard way out here running for president off of a losing Senate bid.
No matter how close you come, if you lose, you lose.
Yeah, and maybe he didn't fully know what he was getting into, or the degree to which it was going to be an uphill battle, Now, there's other factors involved. It was like Mayor Pete Buttigieg.
He came along, Beto's stumbling, more or less coincided with the rise.
Gave him opportunity, that's right. Yeah. And so I don't count Beto out yet. I think that, anything can happen in these electoral cycles, as we all know.
And you've got a couple of dozen people.
Yeah, and people are coming in, dropping out. We have Tom Steyer, the billionaire from California, apparently is coming in.
And Swalwell just dropped out yesterday as we're taping this.
Yeah, so that's where we're at, here in July as we tape this, and who knows where we'll be a month from now.
Well, it reminded me, this whole thing reminds me a bit of the Republicans 4 years ago, where they had 16 or 17 people.
Absolutely.
And it seemed every week there was a new front runner.
Yeah.
Or a new media darling or whatever.
That's right.
And when this sort of thing began to happen with the Democrats, I thought, well, is this cycle repeating itself?
Right.
We're going to have a new front runner every 2 weeks.
Right.
But Beto has, it's remarkable how far he's fallen, I think. As
Yeah.
you say, he could very well come back.
Right.
But for the moment, it hasn't happened.
No, we'll have to see. I think as it gets whittled down, we'll see if he remains, if he has the tenacity to kind of hang in there, even if he's like polling at like 1 or 2% or something. But I personally liked him when I met him. I thought he was a really genuine guy. In fact, he seemed kind of weirdly honest and candid in a way I'd not come across with other politicians. I've interviewed Hillary Clinton and other people, and of course they're all very professional and studied, and they have their thing together, and he was not like that. I mean, the way I got the interview was to walk up to his house, literally walk up to his house in El Paso and just introduce myself to him. And it was a Sunday afternoon, and he was just hanging around at home, with his family, and one of his kids had a cold, and it was a typical scene, and that it kind of endeared him to me a little bit. I thought, oh, he's not putting up a front or anything, and he invited me into his house to hang out and talk to him. So it was kind of interesting.
That probably didn't happen again.
Won't happen again. And I realized as I was writing that story that I was probably the last person who was going to see him kind of in an unfiltered way, for better or worse,
Before we go, besides the record or the CD, what else are you working on right now?
Well, I can't talk about. I've got a profile of another Hollywood actor this fall. A very interesting person, who's going to be in a big splashy movie this fall. Keep your eye out
for Vanity Fair.
For Vanity Fair, and I'm kind of in the middle of conceiving in my new book. And again, I don't want to reveal too much, but I want to write about a musical icon of some importance, and I have been thinking a lot about. There was an interesting interview recently with Whoopi Goldberg, of all people, in the New York Times, and she was asked to explain, why you think things are so divided now, and there's so much divisiveness among different kinds of people, and whereas there might not have been a few years ago. And she said, well, and I'm paraphrasing her, but she was saying a lot of there used to be a lot of veterans of World War II around. There were Holocaust survivors. There were people who were out telling stories of history. But a lot of them have died off. We're at this other stage, and there's not as much awareness of history among younger people right now. There's like, everybody has gone into these factionalized, identity politics, you name it. And she thought it was important for us to tell the stories that were told to us about historical movements. There's Stonewall, it's the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. And the more I've thought about that, and I'm segging into this idea, which is I think there are a lot of major kind of icons that haven't, that I feel like should be carried into the 21st century. You and I grew up with certain kinds of Louis Armstrong or Elvis, name your kind of icon, and some of these icons will fade as we go into the 21st century and new musical genres come along, but some deserve to be reinvented and reintroduced into the 21st century.
It's certainly true, and it's ironic that at a time when everything is available on YouTube or whatever. If you want to read a book or if you want to hear music by a certain artist, it's very easy to get, and it's free. And at the same time, I think you have a generation for whom ancient history is 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And if it's older than that, they don't want to hear about it.
Right.
And yet it's all there for the asking if they want to get into it.
And,
I think Whoopi Goldberg is right.
And on top of that, I think there are ways in which other parts of history, and I'll just pluck one out, the 20s and 30s, you were at a juncture in the new century not dissimilar to ours, where you had all these new technologies that were emerging, radio, TV,
78
records,
RPMs.
and entire new genres and stars and ways of communicating were being invented right there in that moment.
Yeah.
And, and it not only created new kinds of music and film and TV, but it created social change. It changed the way people perceived, for instance, black artists. Black artists were able to kind of break new ground in jazz and in other kinds of genres and shape history.
Mm-hmm.
And Louis Armstrong being a great example. And so I'm interested in finding one of those kinds of figures, and I'm kind of thinking about one now, but I don't want to talk about it, but who's going to be like that, and I think deserves to have that kind of treatment, biographical treatment.
I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that a year ago at the 2018 Book Festival, I interviewed you, and you spoke about Sticky Fingers for just about the whole time, and that is available on demand at nctv18.org, and I believe it's also on YouTube. That's one reason we didn't spend a lot of time talking about it, because it's available other ways.
Yeah.
Joe Hagan, thank you for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
This has been fascinating. I look forward to hearing the music on that CD.
I'm looking forward to you hearing it.
For Profiles on Channel 18, I'm Charlie Walters. Thank you for joining me. Please tune in again next time.
Alexa, play ACKFM.
Good morning, Nantucket. Here's Portugal the Man and Feel It Still.
Good morning, this is Dave from Indian Summer with your surf report.
This is meteorologist Russ Murley, and here's your island forecast.
There are huge bluefish on the east side of the island.
It's time for the classic cut of the day. Here's Don Henley and the Boys of Summer.
If someone asks you what it's like on Nantucket, just turn us on, and we'll take it from there.